The host, a practiced neutral, started with safe questions about craft, their latest projects, the grind of Hollywood, and the new blood coming up in the industry. Denzel leaned back in his chair, his posture calm but deliberate, his answers measured, laced with that quiet gravitas that made every word feel like scripture. Pesci, smaller, wirier, fidgeted with a restless energy, his grin sharp and unpredictable, tossing out quips that landed like sparks on dry grass. The audience laughed, nodded, leaned in, expecting a masterclass in charisma, a nostalgic parade of their greatest hits. But something simmered beneath the surface, a tension nobody could quite name yet, like a storm cloud forming on a clear day. It started with a seemingly innocent jab from Pesci, his voice cutting through the polite rhythm of the interview. "So, Denzel, you really pray every day? That's not just some act for the cameras, right? You actually think someone's up there taking notes?" The audience chuckled, but it was a nervous sound, the kind that senses a line being crossed. Denzel's eyes narrowed, just a fraction, but enough to shift the air. He tilted his head, his voice steady, but edged with something colder. "And you, Joe? You wake up every day thinking life's just one big punchline? That kind of thinking doesn't keep you alive, it keeps you scraping by." The crowd went quiet, the host's smile faltering as he tried to steer back to safer waters. But the hook was set. Pesci's grin tightened, his fingers drumming on the armrest, and he leaned forward, his tone sharper now, like a blade unsheathed. "You talk a lot about morals, Denzel, but we both know you've been at those parties, the ones where people trade their souls for a line and a deal. Don't play saint with me." The accusation hung heavy, not because it was true, but because it was personal, a dart aimed at Denzel's carefully built armor. Denzel didn't flinch, but his jaw tightened, and when he spoke, his voice was low, deliberate, like a man choosing his words with care because he knew they'd cut. "I've been there, Joe. I saw it, but I walked away. You? You stayed, built yourself a throne out of the wreckage." The audience gasped, a collective inhale, as Pesci's face reddened, his eyes flashing with something raw, something dangerous. "I didn't hide behind sermons," he snapped, his voice rising, the Brooklyn edge slicing through. "I played the game by the street's rules. You? You're out here acting like the savior while others cleaned up your mess." The host tried to interject, his voice a nervous chirp, but the room was no longer his. It belonged to the two men, their words like fists, each blow landing harder than the last. The tension wasn't just in what they said, but in what they didn't. Decades of unspoken history, of paths diverged, of choices made in the shadows of fame. Pesci's hands were shaking now, not with fear but with a fury that seemed to have been waiting for this moment. Denzel sat still, but his eyes burned. A quiet fire that suggested he was holding back something bigger, something that could unravel everything. The audience was locked in, not daring to blink, sensing that this wasn't just a spat, but a collision of worlds, of truths neither man had ever spoken aloud. And just when it seemed the air couldn't get any thicker, Pesci leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You were never better than me, Denzel. You just had a better script." Something flickered in Denzel's face. Not anger, not pain, but something deeper, something that promised this was far from over, that whatever came next would cut to the bone. The studio lights seemed to burn hotter now, as if amplifying the raw energy crackling between Denzel Washington and Joe Pesci. The audience, once relaxed, now sat rigid, their eyes darting between the two men like spectators at a prize fight, sensing blood in the air, but unsure who would land the next blow. The host, visibly sweating, tried to pivot with a weak joke about their iconic roles, but it landed flat, swallowed by the weight of what had already been said. Pesci's last words, "You were never better than me, Denzel. You just had a better script," hung like a guillotine, and the silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the studio's air conditioning. Denzel's face, usually a mask of composure, betrayed a flicker of something deeper, hurt, maybe, or recognition, as if Pesci had grazed a nerve he hadn't known was exposed. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his voice low, but carrying the weight of a man who'd spent decades carrying heavier burdens than this moment. You were a great actor, Joe, he said, his tone deliberate, almost mournful. But why did everyone on set walk on eggshells around you? It wasn't just your temper. You didn't just play tough. You were cruel, not just on screen. Tell me, do you even know how to care about anyone but yourself? The question wasn't loud, but it was surgical, slicing through the room with a precision that made the audience shift uncomfortably. Pesci's grin vanished, replaced by a scowl that seemed to age him in an instant, his eyes narrowing to slits. Don't give me that, he shot back, his voice rough, almost a growl. I'm no hypocrite. I didn't learn to love in some acting workshop. And your principles? They're just lines you memorize to sell a better story. Without that script, you're nothing. The words were venomous, but there was a tremor in Pesci's voice, a crack that hinted at something more. Anger, yes, but also a kind of desperation, as if he was fighting to prove something to himself as much as to Denzel. The host tried to cut in again, his voice a nervous stammer about their shared history in the industry, but neither man acknowledged him. The stage was theirs, a battlefield of egos and unspoken wounds, and the audience was caught in the crossfire, unable to look away. The tension escalated as Pesci leaned back, his hands gripping the armrest like he was bracing for impact. You're a symbol for people who don't know what it takes to survive, he said, his voice steadier now but laced with disdain. Me? I'm for the ones who fought tooth and nail, who didn't have the luxury of playing the hero. We're not the same, Denzel. Never were. His words were a challenge, a line drawn in the sand, and the audience felt it. Some nodded instinctively, others clutched their seats, torn between the two men's truths. Denzel didn't respond immediately. He let the silence stretch. His eyes locked on Pesci, not with anger but with a kind of weary clarity. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost too calm, like the quiet before a storm. Maybe you're right, he said, and the admission caught everyone off guard, even Pesci, whose eyebrows twitched in surprise. Maybe we're not the same, but I sleep at night, Joe. Can you say that? Or is your silence just you running from the truth? You're not a philosopher. You're a broken man playing it, I don't care. The words landed like a gut punch, and for a moment, Pesci's face froze, his eyes wide, as if Denzel had reached into his chest and pulled something out he'd spent years burying. The audience was silent, not even a whisper, as if they were collectively holding their breath, waiting for the explosion. Pesci's hands balled into fists, his knuckles white, and he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You don't know me, Denzel. You don't know what I've carried. You think your high road makes you better? It just makes you blind. The air was electric now, every word a spark that threatened to ignite something uncontrollable. Denzel's calm began to crack, not into anger, but into something more vulnerable, a flicker of regret in his eyes, as if he saw something in Pesci he hadn't expected, a mirror, maybe, or a ghost of choices he'd narrowly escaped. I don't think I'm better, he said, his voice softer now, but no less piercing. I just think you're lost, and you're too proud to admit it. Pesci laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that cut through the tension like a knife. But it wasn't joyful. It was the laugh of a man who'd heard the truth and didn't know what to do with it. Lost? He repeated, his voice rising again, the Brooklyn edge back in full force. I clawed my way up from nothing. You? You had mentors, connections, a path. I had to break the world to get here. Don't talk to me about lost. The audience was riveted, their eyes flicking between the two men, sensing that this wasn't just about the words anymore. It was about who they were, who they'd become, and the choices that had carved them into the men sitting on that stage. The host, now a bystander in his own show, glanced at the producers off stage, his expression pleading for a commercial break, but no one moved. This was too raw, too real, and the cameras stayed rolling, capturing every second of the unraveling. Then came a shift, subtle but seismic. Pesci's voice softened, not out of defeat, but out of exhaustion, as if the fight was draining something essential from him. You think you've got it all figured out, he said, almost to himself, his eyes drifting somewhere beyond Denzel, beyond the studio. You think you're above it all because you walked away from the dirt. But you can't wash it off, Denzel. It's in you, same as me. Denzel's jaw tightened, and for the first time he looked away, his gaze dropping to the floor, as if Pesci's words had found a crack in his armor. The audience felt it too, a moment of doubt, a question hanging in the air. Was Pesci right? Had Denzel's principles been a shield, or just a mask? The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken histories, and just when it seemed Denzel might not respond, he lifted his head, his eyes meeting Pesci's again. "I don't claim to be clean," he said, his voice steady but tinged with something raw, something human. "But I chose to carry the weight differently. You? You're still fighting a war you already won." Pesci's face twitched, a mix of anger and something else. Recognition, maybe, or pain. The audience was on edge, sensing that whatever came next would tip the balance. That this wasn't just a clash of egos but a reckoning, one that neither man could walk away from unchanged. And yet, beneath the fury, there was a thread of something deeper. Two men who'd seen the same darkness but had chosen different paths, now facing the cost of those choices in front of a live audience, with no script to guide them. The studio was a pressure cooker now, the air so thick with tension it felt like the walls might crack. Denzel Washington and Joe Pesci sat locked in a silent standoff, their last exchange. "I chose to carry the weight differently. You? You're still fighting a war you already won," hanging like smoke after a gunshot. The audience was frozen, eyes wide, caught in the gravity of two men stripping each other bare on live television. The host, now a ghost of his earlier confidence, opened his mouth to intervene but thought better of it, his hands fidgeting uselessly in his lap. Pesci broke the silence first, his voice rising, sharp and jagged, like glass breaking. "Go to hell with your moral high ground, Denzel," he snapped, his face flushed, his hands slicing the air. "I survived a system that chews up and spits out hundreds like me. You ever go against it? Or did you just sit back whispering, 'It's in God's hands,' while the rest of us bled?" His words were a challenge, a scream from a man who'd spent a lifetime proving he was tougher than the world that tried to break him. Denzel didn't flinch, but his eyes darkened, his voice steady, cutting through the noise without needing to shout. "I didn't sit back, Joe. I just didn't scream to be heard. You? You've been yelling your whole life, scared no one will notice how much it hurts." The audience gasped, a collective jolt, as Pesci's face twisted, his eyes flashing with something raw. Anger, yes, but also a flicker of vulnerability, like a wound exposed. For a moment, he seemed to teeter on the edge of something, his breath heavy, his hands trembling. Then, after a long pause, he leaned forward, his voice low, almost a hiss. "It hurts, all right, but I don't dress it up with Bible verses. I say it straight. You? You're just a pretty facade with nothing behind it." The words were meant to sting, but they landed differently, heavy with a truth neither man wanted to face. Denzel's gaze softened, just for a second, as if he saw not an enemy but a man drowning in his own pride. The room held its breath, waiting for Denzel's response, but he said nothing, his silence louder than any retort. Then, in a twist no one saw coming, Pesci's scowl cracked, and a low, bitter laugh escaped him. "You know what?" he said, shaking his head, his voice softer now, almost resigned. "Maybe you're right. Maybe I'm still fighting. But you're not as clean as you think, Denzel. None of us are." The admission was a shock, not just to the audience but to Denzel, whose eyes widened slightly, caught off guard by the shift. The host, sensing a chance to reclaim control, started to speak, but Pesci raised a hand, cutting him off. "We're done here," he said, standing abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. He looked at Denzel one last time, not with anger but with something closer to recognition, maybe even respect, though neither would admit it. Then he walked off the set, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. Denzel sat still, his face unreadable, but his hands were clasped tightly, as if holding something in. The cameras lingered, capturing the weight of the moment, a clash not just of egos but of lives, of choices made and prices paid. The audience didn't clap, they just watched, some with tears in their eyes, others with jaws set, all grappling with the raw humanity they'd just witnessed. As the show cut to commercial, the question lingered, unspoken but heavy. What did it cost them to bare their souls like that, and what would they carry away from this?